Um, Welcome, everybody. Thanks for showing up today. This workshop is going to be slightly shorter and less formal than some of my workshops are. I'm hoping that this trick that I'm going to teach you will be useful. I think it's a very general trick for making a lot of different types of charts, but we're going to focus on a certain type today. I'll start with a few slides just to get us introduced to where we're going to head today. So like I said, my name is Eric Munson. I work for a department within the Duke University Libraries called the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences, and I am a data visualization specialist. Today, I want to focus on a case that I see quite a bit in people's paper drafts and actual papers, where we've got tables that contain, it can be odds ratios, they can be probabilities, they can just be certain values that also have uncertainty associated with them. Like in this particular table, got some odds ratios and some confidence intervals. And it becomes, this presents the data. It's good for lookup, but it's really hard to glance through this and see the patterns in the numbers, which are the important thing. We can reformat the table a little bit to make the text left aligned. We can sort of bold the important words. We can try to bold the important values while still having the confidence intervals in there. But I tend to feel like there's no substitute for making these sorts of values visual, because within a fraction of a second, we can see the patterns in these numbers of how they dip or go up and down. Whereas it would have taken a lot of searching to look through the table and see a very similar thing. Now, in this particular one, I may have gotten rid of too much of the text. This table part may be a little harder to see, but I think the values are much better, and maybe somewhere in between would be good. This is a table out of a published paper where here it's looking at different marginal means and differences from baselines. And again, there's just a lot visually going on, and our human visual systems are not that great at looking at a bunch of values and taking in the patterns. In this one in particular, it was a little bit tough because I think even the columns that were supposed to be compared weren't even next to each other. So we're supposed to sort of compare this 100U to the 200U case for each of these. And so what I tend to do is play around with different methods of making these visual. My first tries aren't always the best, but in this, I used Excel to try to make what I would call a horizontal dot plot with error bars, or some people might call a forest plot. Now, I know the previous one looks a little bit more like a standard forest plot with the way it's laid out, but trying to combine charts in ways, make them visual in ways that help us see the patterns in those. And so today we're going to do that in Excel. Now, I want to point out that I learned this technique from John Schwabish, who is he's in the public policy area, but he does a lot of training on Excel. He has he has videos, he has workbooks, he has a lot of different things. I wrote a blog post last year around this time, enumerating some of the different things that he does and things I've learned from him. So again, I will paste this link that we're going to use for a Dropbox folder where you can download both a PDF of these slides and the Excel workbook that we're going to use to play around with and make these plots. So I have in this blog post different links to resources that I've found super useful. And the trick that we're going to learn today, I learned from a specific blog post and YouTube video that was on what he called labeling dot plots. So he was creating some what we might call dumbbell plots, where there were two values compared and they have a gray line between them, but they have these labels on different parts of the plots. And so the combination of the tricks of labeling and the tricks of combining these things to make this horizontal dot plot are where I got the inspiration and the techniques for today's exercise. The data we're going to play around with today is, it's just some made up data that has, some different potential models that were run and some responses within some experiment. They've got odds ratios, confidence intervals, low and high end of the confidence intervals, and then p-values associated with them. And I do want to point out that in Excel, it's actually pretty easy to make what I would call kind of a vertical dot plot, where the numeric axis goes vertically, that shows this data pretty clearly. And that is because Excel has a built-in chart type that's called a line plot. Now, a line plot in Excel has a categorical x-axis. So the categories are going to be evenly spaced. And it's even nice because if you merge the cells on the axis, or the column that corresponds to these lower labels, you can even get sort of a hierarchical look to the labels here. So this one is not hard to do with the built-in plot types. But what is harder to do is this horizontal version that I think is really nice because it allows us to have longer labels and still have them be readable. It lets us set up the standard sort of layout for a forest plot where we might have p-values over to the side and we have all of our points with error bars on them. And so this is what we're going to play around to create today. And like I say here, the trick is basically that we're going to treat this as a scatter plot in Excel instead of a line chart, okay? And that just means that we're going to have our regular values that you can see here for the odds ratios. Those are going to be our x-axis values. And then the y values for everything, for our points, for these labels, are just going to be made up integers that we're going to add to our data. And it's just going to be the same technique over and over again of kind of adding new data series to a plot until we get to where we want. But if you download that Dropbox folder, unpack the zip file, should have an Excel workbook called Forest Data and a PDF of the slides that I just showed you, so you can have all those links that I was talking about. These same techniques will work both on Mac and Windows. I'm on a Mac, but Windows is the same thing. There will just be a couple of places where on Windows you actually have some options that are a little handier than on Mac. What I'm going to do is go ahead and just open this Excel workbook and show you, this is the table that I showed in the slideshow. This is kind of our starting data. Now, there are some tricks that I use if I'm copying and pasting data from that's already written in the format where it has odds ratios, or sorry, the confidence intervals inside of parentheses with a comma between. I can show you tricks for that, for splitting apart the data into separate columns, but I decided today to just start with the most basic data here already in each of them in separate columns. I've got two different pieces of things I want to use for a label. I've got my odds ratios. I've got the low and high ends of my confidence intervals, and then I've got a p-value associated with each of these. Now, what I typically do when I'm playing around, and I guess I should show you, there's, in this workbook is a bunch of other tabs showing some different stages of pieces we're going to talk about. I'm not sure that we'll get to all of this, but I wanted you to have some of these pieces. This is how the data is going to look by the time we end, but we're going to start with this original data and just go step by step. I just wanted you to have those other versions for reference later. I usually want to keep my original data around just in case I screw it up. So one thing that I tend to do, the way I do this is I will right click on a tab for my original data, and I'll go to move or copy. And when I do that, it lets me choose which one. I need to check this box, create a copy. And then it doesn't matter exactly where you put it. I think I might move to the end just so it's at the very end of these tabs. So I click move to end for where it's going to show up. And so I get second version here. Now, like I said, one of the tricks that we're going to use is to create a scatter plot where our values themselves for our odds ratios are the X values along our horizontal axis. But we need Y values to plot these points, and we need to just make those up. So I'm going to click next to my odds ratios. You can do this anywhere, but it's a little handier if it's next to the odd ratios column. I'm going to right click on the next column and go to insert. So I've just clicked on the D at the top to select the whole column and go to insert a new column. And then now I may get a little inconsistent with my naming compared to my other tabs that are along the bottom, but I'm going to call this something like Y values. And you can do this in any order, but the things that I want to have show up at the top, so I would like the things that are in the top in the table to show up in the top on the chart. And so these Y values need to be higher. So I'm just going to type like 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in those. You can always start the sequence and then drag the box down to get it to complete the sequence. There's different tricks we could use to get it to complete if it was a really long list. But I'm going to create these fake Y values that we're going to use for plotting the points. I think I am also, I guess right away, the other thing that I need to do is the way that Excel handles error bars. I can't really use the confidence interval endpoints. What it's going to want for the size of the error bars that we add is the length, both in the negative direction, kind of less than the point, and in the positive direction. And so I need to calculate that interval, that length of those error bars. And I can do that any place. I might just insert a couple of columns, right-clicking on the names here, just so I can sort of put them near where the confidence intervals are. Let's call one negative error. So it doesn't really matter what you name these, as long as you know what they are. I'm going to name this neg error and then positive error. Just something so I know what the column means. And then here, I'm just going to do a small calculation. And any calculation in Excel, I click in the cell that I want to enter the calculation in, or the formula, and I start with the equals sign. What I want to do is subtract, in this case, my odds ratio value. So I'm going to take the odds ratio, click on that cell, click minus, and then I'm going to click on this CI low column in that cell on the same row. So C2 minus E2, you could always just type that in. I'm going to hit return to make sure it calculated that properly, and that looks right. I'm also going to go for the positive error. I'm going to enter another formula. I'm going to click in that cell below, say equals. And then in this case, because the confidence interval endpoint is higher than my odds ratio value, I'm just going to click in that F2 minus and click in my odds ratio cell, C2, and hit return. All right, and that looks okay as well. Then there's a bunch of ways that I could copy those and paste them down. What I tend to do is either highlight both those cells by dragging across them and then dragging that corner square down, and that fills them down. Or I'm going to undo. I just hit Command Z or Control Z to undo. If I highlight those cells, and if these cells that I'm filling in are right next to my actual data, I can actually use this trick of hovering over the little square that's in the corner of my selected range and double clicking on it, and it'll automatically fill down. So if I have a really long list of data, I don't have to drag and try to make sure I reach the bottom. All right, and we can check these. They've changed relative to these cells. So now this one is C7 minus E7. C7 minus E7, that's right. Okay, so we're at a good starting place for making the basic plot. Again, anybody speak up if you have questions. To start making the plot itself, I'm going to go to the Insert tab. And I'm going to go down, and scatter plot on mine at least is towards the bottom here, XY scatter, when I hover over it. If I click, oh, actually, sorry, it's going to be better if I select a data range first. So I'm going to go ahead. You don't have to select the column headers. You can do it with or without. I'm going to go ahead and select the column headers on this first one. So I'm selecting from odds ratios down to the bottom of the Y values. And then I'm going to go on my Insert tab over and select the scatter plot with points, but no lines connecting. When I do that, you can see that we've got our basic plot. These are our odds ratios where they're distributed along this axis that we won't need later. And we've got our points, and odds ratios are at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and click on the title and just hit delete because I don't really need that, and that gets rid of it. Another thing that I often do right from the beginning is I'll click on the outside of the chart. You know, I can click off of the chart, just click on the border of the whole chart area. And I'll go back to the Home tab and I'll bump the font size up because the default fonts are so small that maybe I'll go up to 14-point font, something like that. Okay, now the things we're going to do a bunch of work in the formatting pane, and we're going to do a bunch of work of adding new data to this plot as we go. Let's go ahead and do a little bit of formatting to start. Let's format these points. They're kind of tiny. So I click on one of the blue dots, and then I'm going to right click and go to Format Data Series. I think there are plenty of other ways to get to this formatting pane, but on mine, it opens over to the side. And what I want to manipulate here is the size and the color of the points. So these are chart options or series options, but what I want to go to is this fill and line area of my format data series. And unfortunately, a bunch of these things are collapsed and they're not where I want. So I'm going to have to click on markers. So I don't have any line, I just have markers. And then I want to expand, well, right away, I guess I can say no line for the border. I don't really like to have a border line because I don't need it. And because if I decide to change the colors of the markers, if I have a border, I have to change both the border and the fill. And I would rather just change the fill. So I'm going to say no line on the border and then expand this marker options. And automatic is choosing circle, and that's just fine. But to make it bigger, I have to click built in. And then I'm just going to bump up the size to maybe 10 by doing increments, or I could type it in. So that looks like a decent size. And then if I expand the fill portion, I'm going to, instead of blue, I'm just going to change it to, say, orange along the top here. I just think it pops out to my eye a little bit better, so it's a little easier to see the points. So I think that looks good for our basic scatter plot. All right, now, since we added our data already for the error bars, let's go ahead and add the error bars. I've already selected these points. If they weren't selected, I could just, again, click on one of the dots in that series. And on Windows, you're going to have a little menu that's over to the side of your chart here. On Mac, I don't have that. I need to go to Chart Design tab at the top. In Chart Design, I've got this option way over on the left called Add Chart Element. And that's a spot where I can click on that, and there's this option for error bars. Now, the standard options for error bars is that Excel would calculate the length of the error bars. We don't want that. We want to be able to specify the length of the error bars and do some other options. So I'm going to go all the way to the bottom, more error bar options. So it will add error bars here. And you notice because it's a scatter plot that has both an X and a Y axis, it's going to add both X and Y error bars. Now, in this case, what it did, or what it does by default, is to kind of select the vertical ones, which are the ones we don't want. I can just hit delete and get rid of those. Or if they weren't selected, I would just click one of the vertical error bars. It would select them all, and I would hit delete. Now, at this point, all these error bars are kind of the same length. That's not what we want. What we want is to give some options. So I'm going to click on one of these horizontal error bars to select them all. And when I do that, I get some chart options over here in the format error bars. If that wasn't visible, I could always right click and go to format error bars, and it goes over to this chart options. I do want the error bars to go in both directions. In this case, I kind of like the style with the way I'm going to do it to have no cap. You know, again, you can choose how you want your error bars to show up. I kind of like this no cap option. And then we want to specify the value. And so I'm going to click under error amount. I'm going to click in that radio button custom. When I do that, this specify value button becomes active. When I click specify value, now it's giving me what's going to be a very common sort of interface that we're going to use over and over again here, where it expects me to go and select some range of values, and it will put the result in this area here. So so it says positive error value, and that's what I calculated over here from my formula. So I'm going to start not with the header, but just the values themselves. I'm going to select those 6 values while holding down and then let go, and it's going to put the data range in there. And then I'm going to click in this area for the negative error value and do the same thing. Go over to my spreadsheet. You can always move that window if it's in the way. Go and select, drag over those 6 values, and then release. And now I've got the range for the negative error values. When I click OK, you can see that the error bar lengths have adjusted to these values. So that looks pretty good. Now, the only thing I don't like here is I don't like the really sharp black lines for the error bars. I'd like to make them softer and the same color as the points. So I'm going to, in my formatting pane over here on the right, I'm going to click in the fill and line. I still have the error bars themselves selected. And I'm not sure if you have to click solid line or not. I tend to, just to make it clear instead of this automatic. And so I'm going to, in the line part, click solid line. I'm going to change the color to like this second orange color down the second from the lightest. So that's pretty light. So you can't see it when it's thin. So what I want to do is bump up the width quite a bit. So I could type in like the number 5, or I can just click the little button until it gets up to 5. And now I can see this quite well. It's not as prominent as the main point. I don't want the error bars to be the main focus, but I can see them quite well. And I think this looks pleasant. All right. So that's our basic odds ratios. One thing that I tend to do at this point, that's something that, I don't know, the method for doing this always confuses me. I have to practice it a lot to get used to it. We have an opportunity here. For an odds ratio, the comparison level is this numeric 1. Okay, so I'm comparing all my points to the value 1. And so it's kind of nice to have a thicker line, some sort of thicker line at this 1 value to let the audience know that that's our comparison. I can actually play a trick here by moving this y-axis over to this point 1 and giving it a different graphic style and sort of cheat the whole system and automatically draw a line. I can just go draw a line over this. I could insert a line. But what I don't like about that is right now I don't necessarily have everything to say the final size that I want, the final aspect ratio size. If I draw a line over here right now, it won't resize and move exactly how I want. Later on, often what I do for making these types of charts is I would just paste something like this into PowerPoint and then add all the annotations that I want. At that point, if it's already the right size, I can draw a line over it and I don't need this. The other problem though is that I think, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think that line kind of always shows up over the points. I could make the whole thing transparent, put it behind, but that's kind of a pain. So moving the axis, I think also allows us to have this error bar to go over the line, which is kind of nice. Anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on one of the numbers for the x-axis. And I'm going to right click and say format axis. It just goes over automatically to the same options here. I'm going to save myself some time right now by manually putting in 0 and 3 as the min and max and 0.5. Let's say, no, sorry, I'll do 1 as the major and 0.5 as the minor. That'll just hold these later so it doesn't rescale itself when I'm doing some other manipulations. Don't worry about that if you don't feel like doing that now. It's not going to be super important. But the thing that's the trick is vertical axis crosses. Now, automatic is always going to put it kind of at the end of the plot, whatever the end of the range is. I could do it at the maximum end and it would shoot it to that other end. But what I want to do is say axis value and put in the number 1. And so it's going to put that vertical axis at the value 1 on the horizontal axis. And at that point, I can select the vertical axis. So I click like on the number 5 on any of these numbers, and both change its format and get rid of those labels. So if I go right now, I'm still in this format axis area, but I've got the vertical axis selected. I can expand this labels area, and it says label position next to axis. Instead, I can choose none, and it'll just get rid of those numbers that I don't need anyway. And then I can go over to the fill and line area and change the properties of the line. So I am going to select just some sort of light gray for the color of the line. Oh, and I guess it does switch to solid line automatically. Okay, so that's nice. And then I'm going to bump up the width to maybe 2 points. So now if I click off of this, click on some other area, you can see I've got this reference area, and I actually, the error bar goes over that reference line. And you could make it whatever color you want. Okay, now I'm going to make this a little wider, make my plot itself a little wider. I could do that later, but the pieces that we have left are to add the labels over here about which model and response it is over on the left-hand side, and then we're going to want to add the p-values over on the right. I can do this in any order, but lately what I've been doing is kind of making this whole thing wider and then selecting this chart area by just clicking in a blank area in the plot. So select the plot area and then just making this a little narrower. So I sort of prepare my space a bit for my labels and for my p-values. Okay, again, ordering doesn't really matter, but I kind of like doing it in that order. Now, we need to prepare a couple more pieces of our data. Right now, the things that I want to use for labels over on the left are in 2 separate columns, and I want to combine them. And I'm showing you this trick because I actually didn't know that this existed until recently. I'm going to select that C column next to my 2 sets of labels, and again, go to Insert, just to add an extra column where I'm going to put my eventual labels that I want. I'm going to widen this out a bit so it's ready. And then here, I'm just going to give it a header that just called label. Again, doesn't matter what you call it. In here, I'm going to type another formula. So I'm going to start with the equal sign. And then I'm going to click on the first part of what I want the label to say. So this A2 cell. Then I'm going to type the ampersand, which is the shift 7 character. The ampersand is used as a concatenation operator for strings. So I can use this to kind of paste different strings together all in a row. So I want A2 equals A2 ampersand. And then I want a little space, some other characters between. So let's say I do quote, space, colon, space, quote. Any character that you want in between is going to work fine. Or if you just want to add a space between, that's fine. I'm doing quote, space, colon, space, quote. Another ampersand, because that string I want to concatenate onto. Now I will click in this B2 cell, my response text. Once I do that, I can hit return, and you can see this label has been created. I can drag down, I can select that cell, drag down, or double click on that corner. And now I've got all of my labels prepared that I want to have over on my left-hand side. Is anybody having any troubles with any of this? No, we've done a fair amount already. If you see me looking over to the side, it's just because I've got a second monitor over there. All right, well, let's start playing our tricks for adding labels. The main idea is that we are going to add points. For the labels, they're just going to be points that will sit at these positions in our scatter plot. And on those points, those scatter plot points, we are going to add data labels. And usually we think of data labels as being like the value of, a data label on a pie chart might give the percent of that pie chart slice represents. Maybe the X or Y value or the series name. But here we're going to use a trick that lets us specify any chunk of data, any cells for that range of values for the data labels. To add extra series onto our main chart, I click someplace in the blank area on the plot. So I'm not like selecting grid lines or anything. I'm just selecting some blank area here. I'm going to right click and go to select data. When I go to select data, it gives me what I have always found to be a really kind of visually busy and confusing interface that turns out is really useful, but I've always struggled with this. I'm getting better at it now because I've been practicing these tricks. We see our one series that we already plotted. These are our orange points. It called it Y values. What we're going to want to do is to add a new series that'll be our label series. So I'm going to go to this little plus sign down underneath this legend entries here. Going to hit plus. Now I have all this blank area, and I don't really care about the chart data range section. What I care about is this name, X values, and Y values. The name is, I think, mostly for convenience. It helps me keep track of what's what over in this legend entries. So I click in the name cell here in the interface, and I'm going to go over to my spreadsheet and just click this C1 cell that says label. So that's just going to be the name of this series. I'm going to call it label. For the X values, we actually, I should have done this before. I'm sorry. Let me see if no, it's not going to let me. Sorry, I have to cancel out of this. Sorry, I did this in the wrong order. Okay, we need fake X values for our labels, and I forgot to make that. So let's right click on the D column and do insert. So I insert a new column. That one's a little wide, so I'm going to make it narrower. And I'm going to call this one label X. Doesn't matter what you call it, just so you know what it is. And these, I want all these label points to end up at this 0 position in X. So I'm just going to click 0 in one of them, double click on the corner, or you can just type in zeros for all of those. Those are going to be our X values for our labels. I'm just going to move my chart over a little bit. Now we go back, we click in the plot area, we right click, go to select data. And we will start again with what I started before. We want a new series that's going to be for our labels. So I'll hit the plus. I'll click in the name entry area here, and I'll go up and click on this label cell. Again, this part isn't the most important. It'll just show up in this list. In the X values, now we prepared these properly. I'm going to click in X values. And I'm going to go over to this new label X column and just select the data range of all of those zeros. So I'll select those 6 zeros and it enters it in. I will click in the Y values area. And the Y values are the same as the Y values for our odds ratios. We're going to use these over and over again. So I'm going to click from my 6 down to 1 for my Y values. Then when I click OK, I end up with a new set of points here. These are the points that I need to add the data labels to. So I'm going to select one of them. Sometimes I have trouble clicking on it, so just keep trying till you click and it highlights that series of circles. Then I'm going to right click and go to add data labels, or I could go up to chart design, add chart element, and add the data labels. But I find it most handy just to right click, say add data labels. Now by default, it's just putting the Y value on there. To format what those data labels are, we need to click on one of them. So it selects the 6 down to 1 here. And if I go over to my formatting pane, if I click in the label options, or I could have right clicked and said format data labels. Now I see a bunch of options that I want to use here. Let's first set the values to the ones we want. I'm going to click this checkbox value from cells. When I do that, it gives us another one of these range selection interfaces. When I've clicked in there, these are labels themselves. So I'm going to go into this label column and just not select the header, but just the values themselves. So it's grab C2 to C7. I click OK. And now we see we've got our labels, but we also have the Y values. So I'm going to uncheck Y value. And then the label position down below, I want it on the left instead of the right. So I want it hanging over there. So this looks pretty good, except it's done weird things. The text is centered and it's gone to 2 lines on some of these. I want it to be 1 line each. Unfortunately, I don't know, if someone knows a trick for this, please tell me, but I don't know a trick to make all of these boxes bigger besides going on them one by one. So I click one of the labels, it selects them all. If I click on one of them again, it gives me some selectors at the corners so that I can make these boxes bigger. Then when I select the next one, I'm just going to make all the boxes a little bit bigger. Basically, what I need is the ones at the bottom to be big enough so that the text all goes on one line. So one by one, I do these. If it's tall enough, I can just do this center selector on the side, but it still stays tall. So now I've got them all on one line, but they're centered. I want them sitting over next to the axis. In principle, they could be left aligned. I kind of like reading left aligned text better, but it's actually a little unhandy here because it means we would need all of these text boxes to be the same size, and I don't know a good way to make them all the same size. So I'm going to compromise, and this is a decent compromise. I will click someplace else just to deselect those labels and then click once again on one of the labels so I can select them all at once. Now, if I'm on my home tab, I can do right aligned for the text under the formatting here. and it moves them all over to next to the axis. Now at this point, I can do some adjustments to my sizes. I can select the chart itself and make it a little wider. Oh no, because those are so big. Okay, sorry, undo. So it does matter a bit. It looks like that these are quite a bit bigger than the text. So I'm actually going to make all these a little smaller so I have some options to make the whole chart a little smaller. Don't worry about this if you don't feel like adjusting this. I'm just going to do it on mine. Okay. So now I can make this a little less wide and it won't screw up those labels. Now, we don't want these points. We want the labels. Those look good, but the points, I'm going to select the points themselves again, go up to the Format Data series, click on the Fill and Line options, click on Marker, and under the marker options, I'm going to click None. So Fill and Line, Marker options, None. And now when I unclick that, when I unselect those, you can't see those circles anymore. I want p-values over to the right-hand side, and that's going to be the same trick. Okay, but we know now, because we made that mistake before, that before we start trying to add these p-value labels over, we would like to have x values for those. So I'm just going to go ahead and put them right next to the p-values. So I'm going to say, just call it px. Call it whatever you want again. Make sure you pipe in with any questions if you have questions. The p-values, I want to have show up the labels right next to this, on this value 3 on the x-axis. So I'm just going to put 3s in all those cells. Those are going to be my x values for all of these labels for the p-values. And it's really going to be the same thing as before, where I add another series. And so I click on the chart area here, sorry, the plot area in a blank area. I right click and I go to select data. Same thing as before, I'm going to add a new series. So I go down to this little plus, click the plus, I ignore the stuff at the top, I click in the name area. And this one, I'm going to click in this cell K1, which says p-value, just so it shows up in a nice way over in my legend there. On the x values, those are those 3s that we just made. So I click in the x values area, I select the range of all of those 3s and I let go. I click in the y values area, and these are the y values that we are using for everything else. So I want to select over that range. Sorry, that window jumps up, so it gets in the way sometimes, but I'm going to select that range, which in my case is F2 to F7. Once I have that, I click OK. And just like before, I end up with some dots that now I can add data labels to. So I'm going to click on one of these dots that for me are gray. I don't know what color they're going to be for you. I click on one of them, so all those dots are selected. I'm going to right click and say Add Data Labels. I'm going to click on one of those labels and go over to the label options, expand this. And again, I'm going to select this values from cells. When I do that, it lets me select the data range. And in this case, it's just the p-values themselves. I want to select all the p-values themselves. Let go, click OK. And then I want to unselect Y value. And then the label position is over to the right. That's what I wanted anyway. Now I just need to select the gray dots themselves, go back to the fill and line options, click on marker, marker options, and none. All right. So that is the basic plot. Has all of our elements. If I was going to use this, I probably want another label above this that says p-values and something that says like categories, things like that. But that's the basic technique that we're going to use. Now, I can show you some other options that we have, but does anybody have questions about the basic techniques? All right. So another thing, as I looked at this example, we have this alternating big, small for our response. And we can see that there's a pattern in the data that the big one is always larger odds ratio than the small. I would kind of like that pattern to pop out a bit more. And so there's a chance that what I would do is usually I would maybe make a copy of this. So I can even just make it on the same area. I can move this over to the side, and under edit is, oh, it doesn't even show it there. There is an option for duplicate that shows up in PowerPoint. So if you hit Command D or Control D, it's sort of like doing copy paste, but it's just faster. And it just makes another copy. So I did Command D, Control D on Windows to make another copy. And what I'm going to do here is I want to make all of the ones that are small, make that a different color. So when I do that, the problem I have is that all of these are controlled the same color at once. And so if I want to make just some of these a different color, I actually have to click on them individually. So I click again on one of these smalls. I go to the marker and the fill, and here I turn this, say to blue instead. I go click another small one, go to blue, another small one, go to blue. But in this case, all the error bars are orange. And so I think what I would end up doing is clicking on one of the error bars and changing those to more of a neutral color if I was going to have two colors in the on the points themselves. So I would click on some light gray. And now I think this is a little easier to see which the big, which the small are, see the pattern in the data a bit more clearly. The only downside, I think, to this is I would sort of prefer, just aesthetically, I think this works just fine. It's just if you have a huge list of points, it is kind of a pain to change the colors one by one. So I'd rather have Excel do that automatically. And I would sort of rather have the error bars be the same color as the points. I kind of like these with the orange, having the error bars orange. I would sort of like the blue to have light blue error bars. And in this case, I can't just select individual error bars. It only gives me an option for all of them. So I'm not going to go through the whole process right now because it takes a little bit of time. You have to do more of what we just did. But I've got an example here in this tab of, I call it Dots Horizontal 2 series. So I have the original one that we did. I have the manually colored one that I just showed you. And then I have one called 2 series. And there, what I've done is I've sorted my data according to this response. And for just some operational reasons, I put the small on the top and the big on the bottom. That was mostly because I don't remember why. I think there was something about the way it colored it by default. But basically, I split these. So I put all of my, regular, like my Y values I entered in before I sorted. So the Y values, if you look at the dots horizontal, goes 6 down to 1. That is the order that I want these to show up in. Okay, so I want the eventual ordering to be the Y values. Then I sort according to response. and it reorders those. So now I still have the same values associated with the same entries, but they're just in a different order in the spreadsheet. That allows me to have one data series be this first set for the small ones. So that's the ones I added and I turned blue. I had to add separate error bars to those, do all the formatting on them. Then I added another series that was the big ones. I added that to the scatter plot using the same trick we used, right click, select data. I had to add error bars to those and specify their ranges separately and have them colored. Then I added all of the labels at the same time and all the X's or the p-values at the same time. So that part is the same. It's just the data entry I have to do twice. But this allows me to select the orange error bars, color those for the orange dots, to select the blue error bars and color those separately. And this is the type of trick that I used to also make this version that I showed here, where I have sort of paired sets of points with error bars on them. I just gave these kind of incremental, close to each other values. So like if I want these to show up near the value 1, I gave one of them like 0.95 Y value and the other one, 1.05. And I had just a number that I could enter that would change this width. It just changes. I have 0.05 as the original gap. And when I change that value, it adjusts all of them. But this is the point I want to get across, that this technique for setting fake Y values using a scatter plot to do this sort of plot instead of one of the, because it doesn't have the equivalent of a line plot that goes horizontal like this, using a scatter plot allows you to do a lot of customization on where these points end up. You can still have error bars, you can have them colored the same way. So this sort of, there's different names that this has for slightly offsetting points. I really like this because you don't end up, because these overlap. So if I would have plotted both of these at 1, the points themselves wouldn't have overlapped in most of these cases, but the error bars would have. And so I think it's hard to see things when you've got overlapping error bars. So if you offset these a bit, you can still tell they're grouped close together. They go with this value. And then again, what I did here was I just did the main plot along with probably the axis labels here in Excel. And then what I usually do is I will select the chart. I will copy. So I'm hitting Command C or Control C. I go over to PowerPoint, new slide. I usually paste as picture so that this just ends up being a graphic that I can resize, and it's not going to reformat based on the theme that I have in PowerPoint. Now that makes it so that you can't adjust anything once you get to PowerPoint. So you can just hit paste. It needs permission to have access to that file. That's fine. So I can just do a regular paste. And this now is, exactly like it was in Excel, but now it's in PowerPoint. So if I need to change anything about the widths, if I change anything about these, I can do it. And I can still, I can still add labels here, other annotations. So I might put that over there, add whatever other annotations that I need in PowerPoint instead of trying to do it in Excel. And this is my final figure that then I can select all of this, my annotations plus my chart, copy, and then paste as picture into Word. And so now that's just a graphic that I can make bigger or smaller. And that's how I make composite figures in PowerPoint and put them into Word or other documents. All right. We're almost out of time. I appreciate you being with me. If you have any questions, if you ever have questions, just to make sure you know how to get in touch, We have one central email address, askdata@duke.edu. I'm going to put that in the chat. You can always use that to get in touch with me, get in touch with anybody in CDBS. But I'll be happy to sit around and answer any questions that you might have too. Yeah, you're welcome.